Welcome to Yoga Therapy Thursdays. This week we're moving on to strength. We started our series on low back and hip health with Constructive Rest, where we released our psoas, we allowed it to relax. Then we moved on to hip mobility, where we moved our legs in all the directions that our hips will allow us to move. And now we're moving on to strength. So strength, there's a lot of muscles that are incorporated in our hips and our low back and our core, and they all contribute to our hip and low back health. So this week we're starting with the glute max, your gluteus maximus, your butt muscles. It's the biggest, the most prominent of your butt muscles, and it helps with hip extension, so it allows your leg to go back. A lot of people realize that this is a big muscle, it's really easy to work out, but a lot of times we recruit other muscles to do the same action. So today we're going to talk about a few poses that you can do, yoga poses. You can also turn them into general fitness exercises and do several reps of them, or hold them, or add weights to them. This week we're starting with chair pose. So your feet can be in line with your hips, or they can be together. This is also known as a squat. You do it how you would like. Just make sure your knees don't go past your toes once you bend down. If your toes naturally turn out a little bit, that's fine. Just make sure your knees track in line with your toes. So to start with chair pose, I'm gonna turn sideways. I like my feet about hip distance apart, or sometimes I turn my feet in just a little bit so the outer edges of my feet are parallel to the edges of the mat. Your hands can be on your hips, you can have a prayer. You can lift your arms up, but if your lats are really tight, that's gonna cause a little bit of a sway in the back and take the work out of your glutes. So as we bend our knees down, when I think about drawing the tops of the hips towards the low ribs, so there's a little bit of a tuck. If your butt's sticking out, I call this duck butt. You wanna draw the tops of the hips in. You're gonna feel a little bit of core engagement, and this is just a static hold right now. So the action is stopping your hips from just collapsing as you sink to the floor. That's your glute max working. You can stay here, you can pulse, or you can go up and down. You wanna notice where you're putting the weight in your feet. If your weight's going really far forward, you're gonna start to feel it in your quads. If your weight goes really far back, don't fall over, you might start to feel a little bit of hamstring engagement. So you want to notice where your weight is and notice what actions are happening. So moving on, we're going to move on to bird dog. But this is one where you come onto all fours, you want your wrists underneath your shoulders and your knees underneath your hips. You can walk one of your knees in so it's in line with the midline of your body for balance. So I'm going to lift up my left leg, so I walked my right knee in just a little bit, and shift my weight to the right and lift up my left leg. I'm gonna do this with a bent knee. A lot of times when we straighten our leg, we end up over-recruiting our hamstrings to do the same action. You wanna also make sure your hips are parallel to the floor. If you lift your hip up and start doing this, you're gonna end up using your glute medius, which we'll talk about next week. So square your hips to the floor, knees bent, just do little pulses up. It doesn't need to be a large movement. A small, short, movement is what gets the action. And again, you can play around with just holding it, pulsing. And for this one, I would avoid doing large movements unless it's bringing the knee down and lifting the knee back up. But really focus on feeling this in your glutes. So our third and final exercise for the glute max that we're gonna go over is bridge pose. We did this last week for hip mobility. We've done this in the past as well to get into constructive rest, or as another version of constructive rest, allowing the knees to fall in, not lifting up the hips. For bridge pose, you want to think about tucking your tailbone under just a little bit so the low back comes down to the floor. And just like we did in chair pose, think about drawing the tops of the hips towards the low ribs, engaging the core. You want your knees in line with your hips, and your heels are about where your fingertips can touch on. It varies. Sometimes grab a mirror or ask somebody for help and you might get a better idea of where your feet are supposed to go. Make sure your gaze goes straight up. Keep the weight evenly spread across both feet and then lift your hips up. So here we want to think about actively squeezing our glutes. That's creating that hip extension, straightening out this line from the knees to the hips. From here, again, you can hold. You can pulse, or you can do large movements, going down and up I think we talked about this before. Feel free to move with the breath however feels best for you. Now, just like in chair pose, if you start to press the weight towards the balls of the feet, you're going to start to feel this in your quads. And if you think about drawing your heels towards your shoulders as you lift up, you're going to feel your hamstrings activate. For this, we want to avoid using the hamstrings. So really focus on trying to keep the weight even and really just feeling the glutes engage as you lift up. Thank you for joining me this week on Yoga Therapy Thursdays. This week, we worked on strengthening our glutes. We started in chair pose, worked our way to bird dog, and then to bridge pose. So we started the series in Constructive Rest where we released our psoas. Then we moved on to hip mobility, and now we're working on strengthening. I encourage you to do those in that order to get the most out of these exercises and to help you find the best health for your hips and your low back. This is just a sample of the exercises you can do to help strengthen your glute max. This wasn't meant to be a follow along. I only did my left side. I really need to do my right side. So I'm hoping to put a little butt burn together, maybe a 10-15 minute workout where you guys can follow along and we can get the most out of our strengthening exercises. I'll keep you posted on when that's going to happen. Thank you for joining me this week on Yoga Therapy Thursdays. See you next week.